Good evening. Welcome to our program. My name is Don Cooney, and in just a very, very short time here in Kalamazoo, we're going to have an election. And an election is a very important time in our city because it is the realization of part of the American dream, which says that people have the right and the responsibility to govern themselves. Now, in this election, we are going to be voting for candidates, but behind those candidates are issues. And there are very critical issues which are facing our city right now. And in this time that we have together, we're going to discuss some of those issues. And I wanted to discuss them not just on the local level, but in the context of what is happening nationally and internationally. And I'm delighted to have here with me tonight Dr. Rudy Siebert, who has been all over the world, traveled all over the world, spoken with people all over the world, and has a wonderful global dimension of how the issues that we face in this city are playing themselves out on the national and international level. So we invite you to stay with us for the next few minutes to look at these issues and to examine what is going on in some of the critical issues we face here, and how can we see them in the context of the global development that is going on around our world today. So, Rudy, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
You know, one of the things that, that strikes me as we get towards an election is that there has been a poor turnout in the past in city commission elections, and there's been a poor turnout even in national elections. Is this the same thing all over the world, or are we atypical here?
I think it is very widespread. People are somehow involved in their own, what the philosophers call the life world, our families, our neighborhoods, maybe our church groups and artistic groups and so on. But it takes a certain step to go into the political realm. And so our students, for instance, have become very apolitical. In the 60s, 70s, they were very active and so on. And then came Kent State shooting and killing in Mexico City and so on. And they were driven inside. And now they are very privatized and they are very unpolitical. I think it has gone too far. And I wish sometimes they would be more in contact with the historical process, the political process, and so on. And I think that is very widespread in the last 2 decades, which was under neoconservative control, that people, were more concerned with their particular interests and not with the common good of the political community. And so I think the question is how one can motivate people to take seriously their own citizenship, as you have done all these years, and have always admired you for your thoughtful activism, not a thoughtless activism, we have that too sometimes, but a thoughtful activism and a devotion, to this being a citizen. But it is very hard, I think, to mobilize this on a worldwide level, I would say.
That's interesting that it's happening worldwide. And I think it's a mistake for people not to participate politically, because it's clear to me that government can make a difference. I mean, we see in this country how on the national level, government has made a difference. We now have health care for older people. We would not have had that if the government didn't intervene. We have laws about safety and health in the workplace. We have laws that guarantee people the right to vote. And all these things came out of people's struggles, which they translated into the political process. I think of Dr. King. Dr. King fought to get the issues of justice on the political agenda and to get them through. So the issue is then, how do we mobilize people? How do we get them involved?
I mean, what you said, it's just proven here because the president signed a bill which will come down here with $1 million to clean up the Kalamazoo River and so on. So the army will be involved, but the university will be involved, and this was only possible through political discourse and participation in it. So we have to ask why masses of people are nevertheless alienated from the political order. And So not simply stand there and throw our hands up and say, well, there are such a low participation and so on. But what is the core of this alienation from the system, so that people say it doesn't make any difference, or one vote doesn't make any difference? I mean, one vote can make a tremendous difference.
Absolutely.
But I mean, it's even of a long-standing type of a feeling in democracies that, these are mass democracies. And in these mass democracies, the individual thinks, well, I can stay at home. It doesn't make any difference. Somebody else will do it or whatever. And that is very, very dangerous. So at least that is one little thing. Then, of course, if the politicians, are not the best ethical types, then people get turned off and so on and say, whatever we do, they always do something else, or they are serving, certain interests, and these are not our interests, and so on. So I think there are a variety of factors which are behind that alienation. And in public discourse, political discourse, we should address those factors which make for this widespread alienation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the things that I understand as I go door to door through the city and as I talk to people here is a lot of times people feel that government does not deal with their issues, that what they're talking about has nothing to do with their lives. Well, I don't think it will have anything to do with their lives until people get involved in the struggle. I mean, I think in the early years of this century, when the federal government was not involved nearly so much, but local governments fought for child labor laws. They fought for decent schools in their cities. They fought for public health laws. And all those things had a tremendous influence on the quality of life of the people. And I think the same thing could happen today. If people mobilized, got their people sitting up there in the city government, their issues could be front and center on the agenda. And I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah. That's right. So, I mean, we have all this evidence, New Deal or whatever. But we have now 20 years of neoconservatism with small government all the time. And if this neoconservative stuff comes to its end now, it is not because of Clinton or because of Blair or because of Schröder in Berlin or whatever, but it is rather because of the contradictory position of neoconservatism. On one side, they say small government, and then they vote for $290 billion or what dollars for arms. I mean, the Air Force has not been privatized yet. So obviously, these dollars go into government. They make government bigger. And whenever the banks of the rich in New York or whatever collapse, then it's the federal government which has to come in. And if they cannot compete in Europe, then the federal government has to come in. There's some kind of socialism for the rich. So, but I mean, this continual propaganda that government should be small or whatever means for many people it should not be important. It should be some kind of a night watchman. And so we go on with our everyday life world, and then as small as possible over there. But then when we have a hurricane, or we have a tornado, or we have a flood or whatever, suddenly everybody shouts and screams for the federal government, local government, state government, and so on. And neoconservatism cannot last because of this internal contradiction. One cannot go on like this. One has to make up one's mind.
Right.
If you want to have small government, then don't call for help all the time.
I think that's an excellent point. An excellent point. We're spending whatever it was, over $268 billion on the military, when we're not in any war, and we spend more in our military than the next 10 nations of the world combined, and most of them are our allies. So there is money going to the government. It's not going to the people's interest. And I think activism, participation, can restructure that, can force it to go to people's issues. That's my hope. It seems to me like Germany's a pretty good example of a nation where people have participated and the quality of life has been much higher in terms of putting a floor under people than we see in this country.
Yeah, very much so. And there's where we have to become specifically American now. The Germans, have national health insurance since 1870. We have started to discuss it in 1912, and it's now 1999, and we are still not much further or so. And again, instead of despairing or so, I think we have to go through the work to analyze this, why this happens. We simply have a very individualistic attitude. That means everybody should care for himself, should fight for himself, and so on. Now, this is this old liberalism of 1850, which the neoconservatives have brought up again. But I mean, the Roosevelt liberalism, you know, the New Deal and so on, that changed that somewhat, you know.
Yeah.
It introduced, by the way, from the papal encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, this principle of subsidiarity, or so, where you say, okay, the individual should take care of themselves. But what if they can't? Well, then the family has to come in. And what if the family cannot help itself? Then, well, the town has to come in, the city or whatever, or the state or the federation. And it may be a catastrophe where the federation cannot help itself, with these down there where states suddenly have this hurricane or whatever. Then a large number of nations, and maybe the UN has to come in. So I think, but we have an extremely abstract type of an individualistic thing, as if not everybody could have some kind of a catastrophic illness suddenly, which is, you know, he cannot help himself. So then we have to ask for the higher unit, and we have to ask for the local government or state government or even federal government. Right? So I think that this bias, this extremely individualistic bias, gets in the way, and that is why we somehow are lagging a little bit. I mean, even behind Ontario, which has OHIP, you know, or England since 1949 has national health insurance, and so. Right. But we have this horribly hard time. So we have to deal with this. It's part of our social character as Americans and part of our culture. And I think we have to reflect on this, but in public discourse, not only privately, but in a public discourse in the city and so on. If we could not balance this a little bit more, I mean, there is a good thing to be individualistic, but there's also the issue of solidarity, you know, of helping each other. And, you know, if we are...
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, where the nation comes together most is in times of the wars. Yeah. And recently there's been a series of books about the Second World War and how the country came together around that. But in times of peace, we spread into our individualistic areas.
Yeah. And Carl Schmitt, Hitler's political theologian and jurist, and so on, he defined the political as identifying the enemy. And the friend, of course, too. As soon as you identify the enemy and you somehow make him demonize him, you know, Saddam Hussein or Milosevic or whatever, then, of course, you get, that means the outside enemy brings about inner integration and so on. No, but this is a very costly type of a thing. And the question is, are there not other ways how one can get some solidarity? Now, it is true, you know, that we leave our individualism behind when we have a flood, when we have an earthquake and so on. Suddenly, we all go out of our houses, you know, and help or open them up and give people to eat and so on and so on. But as soon as the system is reestablished 3 days later, everybody goes back into his own life world and is just an individual and forgets his citizenship and whatever. So why can't we, in normal times, also be solidary with each other, see? Why do we need catastrophes in order to bring that about? And
that's really interesting, because I think you root it in the very ideology that is at the heart of our economic system, which is an individualistic kind of a system. I think about Dr. King a lot, and what he said he was striving for in his life was the beloved community, where people would care about each other and they would build things together and people would be responsible towards each other. That's what he strove for, and I really think that's a vision we have to rekindle here.
Yeah, it's a beautiful vision. The question is then, you know, what gets in the way of it?
Yeah.
And then to, you know, like a medical doctor, seriously to think this would be such a beautiful vision, but what gets in the way all the time? What holds us back, you know, inside? I mean, even in our psychic apparatus, what holds us back?
And that's the challenge that we face. And I think that that is something we've got to come to grips with in this city. We have to reach out to the people that feel alienated, that feel that they're not a part of the city. We have to get their issues in the public discourse in this city, and I think we need to work on that. Well, I'd like to move on to another area right now, and it's an area which I know you're very, very familiar with, and that is the whole issue of the global economy, where we are in the global economy. All of a sudden, Kalamazoo is thrust into a world where economic competition is not just local, it's not just national, it's international. And there are enormous changes taking place, and there are a lot of winners and losers in this economy. What's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, some development, you know, which goes back to some extent. I mean, under liberal capitalism, under which the city was founded. And Dr. Kellogg, practically organized everything. I mean, the city commission and all of the churches and everything. So that is where you had this entrepreneur, this individual, and his initiative and his imagination, established whole cities and so on. And I think up maybe to the 20s or so, the big businessmen, or not so big, but nevertheless here in this town, met here at the Bronson Park there in this country club building there, Park Club, yeah. And they very much decided what would happen in the city, and they were in charity, participated in charities, and they were also a little bit under control of the people because they always knew, their family stories and all this. So, but that was another era now, and I think that the 30s, 40s, and certainly after the Second World War, all that changed. So that one does not know anymore who owns the city, So, I mean, it may be some sheik from Saudi Arabia or so who owns part of the city, or who owns the slums or whatever, So, therefore, it has become more anonymous, the whole thing. And the step from liberal capitalism to monopoly capitalism, oligopoly capitalism, which transcends by far not only the local government, but also the state government. I mean, General Motors has a budget bigger than the state of France and so on. So it doesn't fit very well into Michigan. And, but even the federation, so the connections between multinational corporations and takeovers, it is all transnational. So, and this is, it moves us to what I call all this alternative future number one. That means it is not liberation, it is administration. It's a totally administered, bureaucratic, computerized, wired type of a society, a signal type of society, in which even the individual entrepreneur, nobody knows them anymore. I mean, there was a time when people knew who was the board of General Motors. They knew who the president's cabinet was or whatever. But you could ask around there, they know neither of the two. It has become very anonymous. It is not the initiative of the individual entrepreneur, but it's now boards and groups and procedures and so on, rather than individual people. And that makes it difficult. Who is accountable? I mean, who polluted the Kalamazoo River? Find out about it. Identify it. You can go far back, and then you can still identify individuals. But afterwards, they are all collectives. They suddenly are accountable, or nobody's accountable anymore.
And they're not local, and you don't see these
they're not
people.
Local,
They're not here.
That's right, yeah, exactly. And that makes, of course, this political system and the economic system are out of balance in a certain sense. You see this, for instance, the medium of the economic thing is money. The medium of the political system, from the local level up, is power, of course, And you see that people who run for offices now, many of them have suddenly to drop out. Why? No money anymore. Mrs. Dole, for instance, And she was quite honest about this, right? So now, is it now democracy or is it a plutocracy? What is it? And we have to, in this public discourse, political discourse, we have to reflect on this too. What has happened that the candidate who has most money then will be most likely to get it. And I'm afraid that may someday also play a role on the local level already,
Yeah, so money has taken the place of government in a lot of ways as the determining factor about what's going to go on, and people are afraid. I think a lot of people are afraid. They're afraid businesses start to leave our city. Then jobs, I mean, we've had a number of those over the last couple of years, which really frightens people. And then also our workforce is in competition with another workforce which will work for much cheaper wages, and our people are very, very afraid of that.
Right. Well, because capital is always attracted by the lowest wages, of course.
Right.
And therefore this whole trend to the south, General Motors left Flint and goes south and so on. Even if they make good profit up here, they still want to make more profit. It's a maximalization of profit as a principle, and maybe the only value which governs the whole thing. And so they say, well, capitalism does not mean to honor your hometown. That we come from Flint doesn't mean we have to honor our hometown. So they go to Mexico or whatever. And even the Germans come over here and go into our south there because it's cheaper than Germany. So that seems to be the main factor, cheaper labor and cheaper resources. That's where they go. And there is no solidarity. There are not even very much political considerations, It is just, we are there to make profit. And that's it. And we have to do that. I'm sorry, we don't want to lay you off. but we have to do this. So it is not so that there is an evil business guy who wants to let people go. It is rather that and that is why he doesn't feel guilty.
Yeah.
He thinks he is under laws, market laws. He can't help himself. So suddenly you have the worker and the owners, the capitalists, and not to speak of the managers, who are bound by the same law. They must go down, or they would say, or we go under. And what does it help you when we go under? It doesn't help you neither. So therefore we have to go down. And there are compulsions. I mean, it's a compulsive type of a system. You know, I mean, the economy here was never democratic. It was always oligarchical. But it is not even the oligarchy, which is free. They will not say, you know, we will freely let 20,000 people go in Flint or whatever. They will say, we have to, you know, or we go under.
It's the logic of the system.
Yeah, it's the logic of the system.
And it's a system which is geared towards the maximization of profit
Yeah.
and not towards the quality of life of the people.
It is materialistic and it's atheistic. You cannot refer to a higher force, you know. If John the 23rd withdraws and says our slums in Kalamazoo are not providential, and withdraws, you know, legitimation to the capitalist system, well, they don't react to it, you know. They use religion, but they don't obey it or whatever.
Yeah.
So therefore there is the question, you know, how can one transcend this system in order to break this compulsion? It's the free enterprise system, but it rests on horrible compulsions to which the workers and the owners are both victims in a certain sense, right?
Yeah. So it's quite a challenge at the local level because we exist inside that kind of a system.
Yeah.
So how do we move forward in that, I think is
well, even the local politician, I think, would have to help to this enlightenment process.
Yes.
That people know where they are. You know that 99% of our 180 million workers think they are middle class, you know. So that one is honest and that one's consciousness about oneself really is not a false one. It's important because if one has a false consciousness about one's status, one votes the wrong party, one votes for the wrong politicians, and so on, and then is more hooked later on. So now, but this is not an easy job, of course, and the politician should have help from the teachers, you know.
Right.
I have you know, people from Croatia in my house, and the boy goes to high school. He was told yesterday that Stalin attacked Hitler or whatever. So, or that Socrates was not a homosexual, or things like this. If we produce this type of false consciousness, you know, it's very hard to do something because one has to be conscious of. If I think, you know, that the Russians attacked the Germans or so, then I may say that Milosevic attacked NATO or whatever. Yeah. And then we get completely confused, you see. So, I mean, the politician, the teacher, and the minister, and so on, they all have to participate in this enlightenment job, you know.
And I think that's one of the great values of this living wage discourse we've had in the city. Yeah. I mean, I think what we've tried to do is put on a table and say, we got a problem in this city. We had a problem with a 4% unemployment rate and a 26% poverty rate. We got a lot of our people who are working full-time but not able to support their family. Now, that's a contradiction in the values we have in our system. And I think what we've done is we've generated a discourse around this city about this whole issue.
Yeah. And you were very active in to have this discourse. And in this discourse, it becomes also clear, you know, that those who represent the owners then somehow do not have an adequate, impression of the whole thing, because I heard very often that these are handouts or whatever, you know.
Right.
No, the living wage does not mean handout.
No.
It does not mean charity. It means that the worker gets a larger part of his own product. It's not charity. Yep. See, and this is where things are confused, where certain categories like surplus value and so on are missing, and on purpose. That means by language regulation we leave it out, and then people can suddenly have this attitude, you know, you want to have more money there, well, why should I give you more money or whatever? But in reality, it is nothing else than that the worker produces $100 a day and gets 25. He should get more from his own product, not from anybody else's product, but his own.
Yeah, and the imperative on which the system is driven is maximization of profits. Whereas I think there has to be another principle in there, and the driving principle has to be that every person deserves access to what they need to lead a human life. I mean, that seems to me that in the Bishop's statement and in other words, that is the purpose of an economy. Yeah. And when we don't bring that principle in, then we operate on a very, very false.
And the news media, the news monopoly, you know, brings up every week, you know, one of these tremendously successful guys who started out with 10 cents in New York, and now he has 10 billion or whatever, you know. That, I mean, he cannot possibly have produced 10 billion. You know, you have only so much working time available. So that means he appropriated other people's labor, collective labor, right? And then we admire that guy for having robbed the whole community, you know. I mean, I told my students, whenever somebody comes up and says, last half year I've made another billion or whatever, call, you know, the police station and catch him, you know, as fast as possible. But not only that, we don't catch him, but we think that is the ideal. As if the purpose of the economy was to have 100 millionaires or billionaires or whatever, you know. The purpose of the economy, you know, is of course to give clothing and housing and food and education and health insurance and so on to all those who are the producers. You know, the capitalist is not the producer. If people go on strike, he doesn't have a thing. He only has a thing when people are working. So, and even advertisement where somebody says, you worked for your money, now let your money work for you. That has to put into clear text, you know. It means maybe you worked for your money, but now let somebody else work for you, you see. So therefore, the things are continually hidden, you know. I met my great friend, Gregory Baum, in Montreal just 2 days ago. And he said, you know, I have this, I got my savings for 10%, you know, interest and so on. And he said, do you know, I mean, I didn't work for these 10%. So somebody must have worked for it somewhere, you know, in Central America or whatever. I live from other people's labor who cannot feed their children, you know. So when my students sometimes say, you know, we want to have $100,000 and you are so critical and so on, I said, I'm not critical. You should have your $100,000, but just look if every dollar in your pocket is covered by your own work, and then be happy. You know, have the 100,000, have 200,000, 300,000 or whatever. But if there's $1 which is not covered by your work, if it should have value, it must be covered by somebody else's work who didn't get it. And that is robbery, you see. But, you know, there is a wall against this type of thing because of continual conditioning. And this is where I think that enlightenment, you know, by the politician or by the educator and so on.
Yeah, and I think there's two different things that have to be done. It seems to me that we have to hold out some kind of a vision. We have to say, this other principle is valid. We need to have individual people have access to what they need to lead a human life. We exist now in a system where these people have to survive. So we have to move towards that goal. And meantime, we have to find a way to let them survive in the system that they exist now, too. And it seems to me the living wage is a part of that whole struggle. It just has to be a piece of that,
I mean, then you as a local politician and devoted as you are, you have, of course, always this experience, you know, where you then run with your head against walls, you know. Because there's first of all, there's the appearance of the system, and if you don't do anything, you're very happy with the appearance. But as soon as you become a thoughtful activist, as you are, then repetitively you will then touch the structure, you know. So if some of our students sends out vitas and then gets 100 vitas back, and then he has touched the system. Whenever it gets painful, you have touched the system. And this is, you know, what we have to touch together. I mean, not individuals running their heads bloody, but the whole community must face its own structure and reflect on it. Is this the best way to make a living? Is this the best way to reproduce ourselves economically? We do have to reproduce ourselves economically.
Certainly.
But what is the way which has the least amount of human suffering, human humiliation, human degradation, and so on? That is what we have to think about. The right society. That is the vision, you know. To have the vision of a right society, and then the question, how do we get there?
Right. My friend Jim Hightower, that I read a lot, said one time a real short quote, which I really think fits. Everybody does better when everybody does better. If we look on ourselves as a community and realize that when people at the bottom come up, it's better for the people at the top. We'll all do better when everybody does better. Which brings me to another point. The city now has committed itself to a poverty reduction policy. You go around the world and there's poverty everywhere. But it seems to me that, at least in the European countries, they're doing more to get their people out of poverty than we are here.
Well, if we look at it in a macro way or micro way, one can look at it in different ways, and both are very much justified. But we have these capitalistic core countries in the Euro-American civilization and so on. And these core countries have been able, through colonialism, imperialism, and so on, to lift their system up, the whole system, to a higher level, so that the poor people on our north side or wherever are richer than the people in Calcutta. And liberals as well as fascists had this same thing. I mean, Hitler's idea was, to solve the class struggle or the whole antagonism of the classes, the poor and the rich, by colonizing Eastern Europe. And he tried it in a militaristic way. 50 years later, we did the same thing with the credit system and the World Bank, which is our bank, and so on. And they all got into debt and collapsed and so on. So Hitler knew that one could do that, in this economical way too, but he thought he would not live that long, and he was very right. And therefore, he wanted to have the fast way, the military way. But it means that if you can colonize and you can then get cheap labor from these areas and so on, you can pay your own workers a little bit more and still make the high profit, When Kellogg pays 35, 75 cents or whatever in Mexico or South Africa, of course he can afford then to give his workers more than this, right? And these workers could never compete with these workers over there, and they do not feel solidary with them neither. Our workers did not feel solidary with the Vietnam workers in the Michelet Rubber Company or whatever. And our colonies are Central America and Latin America. The British and the French had it in Africa. The Germans, certainly the Italians, got in the way too. And then, of course, Hitler made this proposal that he wanted to have Eastern Europe as his colonial territory, So bombed Belgrade, as we just did again, and so on. So, so this is, one cannot separate clearly domestic and foreign politics anymore. It goes very much into each other, what you do outside and what you do inside. And so the level on which our people operate has something to do with what we do with the other people outside, to what extent we can exploit them and so on. And so therefore we have the whole southern hemisphere of the globe, in this horrible poverty, while the upper half, the northern half, has these core countries in which it went very well. And let me say this, maybe we think Greenspan did it, our prosperity in the last 10 years. And I mean, federal control, of inflation and so on is very worthwhile and all this. But or the Clinton did it, or this or that party. In reality, I think how people live has something to do if capitalism expands or if it contracts. And the breakdown of the Soviet Empire opened up the whole Eastern Europe and therefore allowed a tremendous expansion. And this expansion was reflected in the stock market and in a low unemployment level, 4.5 or whatever.
Here,
in this country, yeah. And also in European countries to some extent. So capital moved in very fast into Eastern Europe, robbed as much as possible, and pulled out very fast again. But there were tremendous gains, of these investments. 3, 4, 5, 6 times the investments were taken out, as we did in Chile before, and so on. So, and that is then, it blooms. Now, when capitalism contracts, then hell is loose, of course, and you feed it on all levels then, and the poor more than anybody else. So this type of a mechanism, I think now that maybe this expansion has come to its end. I mean, the stock market had some losses in recent weeks. Our professors found out that, for instance, between June and September, their pensions got down a little bit, and so on, which may or may not signal that the time of expansion is over, that we have either found the resistance of Western European capital, which also massively wanted to have cheap labor and resource in the Ukraine and so on, or that the people over there then have resist now the return of the bourgeoisie and the return of capitalism. And I found that out in Chile, not in Chile, in Kiev and in the Ukraine and so on, in Yalta. And the war, our attack on Yugoslavia, brought about a solidarity of all Slav nations, of all Orthodox nations. NATO killed over 10,000 people in Yugoslavia, of about 20 different ethnic groups, including Albanians. And so nevertheless, the Orthodoxy and the Slavic people identify very much with those people whom we have killed there. and hate us so much that I could not go in October. I could not go to Kiev again, return to Kiev again, to Yalta, with a conference which I had about religion and politics. And they said they could not guarantee our safety, particularly not mine from America, but also those from other NATO states. So, and therefore it is possible, that the expansion will slow down or whatever, and that will be reflected here as well. So now, as a local politician, one has to see how can one adjust to this, either to expansion, as we had in the last 10 years, or to a contraction if it comes about,
Yeah, and it seems to me that one of the keys is what you said, internationalism, a sense of solidarity. And I see some very encouraging signs on that. One thing is the movement on college campuses about students against sweatshops.
Yeah.
These students who are now saying that we don't want the names on our shirts, University of Michigan, Western Michigan University, Kalamazoo College, if those shirts were made by people who are earning 60 cents an hour or 35 cents an hour. And so they're forcing now companies to make the factories public where they make those things, and then they investigate them to see if they're paying a living wage. So it seems to me that the living wage principle is international.
Yeah.
We want people to get a living wage here. We want people to get a living wage there because it's not fair if they don't. So that's a struggle. That's a struggle, the economy and how we can adjust and how we can survive and how we can preserve a high quality of life for our people here, and at the same time reach down to those in our community who don't have a high quality of life and bring them up.
The question is now if this is possible, because the sweatshops, where you get it very cheap, then of course makes the products cheaper and the income of the capitalistic groups bigger. But is it possible that the capitalistic power elite would be satisfied with less profit, for instance? Does one have to take 7 times of investments out, as they did before Allende, for instance, in Chile, in the copper industry?
Yeah.
Or would it be enough, if one takes 3 times out? Particularly when they will be confronted with socialistic countries like China or so. Right. The Chinese will have trade and so on. They will allow a certain amount of exploitation, but they will say, well, you cannot take 7 times out. You can take 2 times out. We want you to make some profit. We understand your system. You have to make profit. But, not 6 times, but 2 times and so on. So is this type of an adjustment possible? Because what you want, it would have mean to an adjustment that wants to we do not maximize profit, I'm always, when I went to the kibbutzim, in Israel, I visited those kibbutz factories. And so some of them produce glass. And they said, well, we could make 10,000 windows, next month. But we make only 5,000. Because we want to have our community life. We don't want to spend everything in work or making profit. We just, this is enough, good living is that. I mean, this is where a political group then dominates the economy in a certain sense and says, what is good for the common good, for our community, for our communicative action, community rationality, not only instrumental action, making windows and so on. I mean, but these are little kibbutzim, they are maybe 150,000 people. So what do we do in huge countries with 260 million people,
What a challenge. I was this morning at a factory. I was meeting people as they were coming in, coming out of their different shifts. And I was talking to them, and I said, how many days a week do you work? And they said 6, sometimes 7 days a week. Yeah. So when you're doing that, you don't have much time for family. You don't have much time for public life. We talk about problems with our children, and a lot of the problems stem from the fact that 2 people have to work and they're not there. It's a very interesting statistic that in 1998, the average working family in the United States was making only $1,000 a year more than they were making in 1989. But the average family in the United States was working 6 weeks more a year. So it seems to me that the kind of system we got is forcing people out there just to survive.
Yeah.
And we pay a lot of costs for that in terms of our whole society.
Yeah, in terms of mental conditions and all
stress,
these depressions and all this. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
So that means the capitalist system, as it moves now, consumes the outside environment, but it also consumes the inner nature of people, which one doesn't see. I took my students to Delano Clinic recently, not in order to leave them there, but So where masses of people come in all the time, and they don't think anything is wrong with them, but they appear in the emergency stage because they want to jump out of the window or whatever, you know.
Boy.
But though a lot of people don't know really what happens to them in this system, right? When you always, since it is an antagonistic system, you always have this feeling, you know, I don't want to become a loser, you know. I want to be a winner, and it pins you also against the other person all the time. But what this is doing to the psychic apparatus, you know, when you always say, you know, I must be a winner, I must not become a loser or whatever, or now I'm a loser or whatever. These are horrible things, you know, psychologically.
Yeah.
And so we must not only think, you know, what capitalism means worldwide, this mode of reproduction, but also what it means for our psyche down the long run.
You know, I'm struck how the shootings that have taken place in schools around the nation, a lot of them haven't taken place in very poor schools. They've taken place in schools where the families were fairly well off. And you have to wonder, is there something going on in our system that is causing such stress, such
I mean, we do reproduce ourselves competitively, you know, and antagonistically in a certain sense. And this goes into the social personality of everybody. And I think that these shootings, you know, and they happen wherever our system goes.
Right.
So, for instance, in Croatia, they have the same shooting now in Zagreb, you know. Never did they think of something like this. But wherever the system goes, these phenomena appear. And I think it is somehow an expression of the antagonistic character in the students. You know, sometimes it's even right-wing extremism. Sometimes they have a swastika or whatever. So and fascism means, of course, the aristocratic law of nature, the predator and the prey, the winner and the loser, and so on. And we have to be careful. There's sometimes liberals who say, you know, the liberal tradition, or conservatives are really liberal, you know, of the old type, would say there must be winners and losers, you know, like President Bush said, and so on. And it is this thing, you know, which finds its expression then in all kinds of places, and now even in our schools, you know.
Yes, sad. And the level of violence in our society is really shocking, I think, compared to any other.
And see, when we separate psychology and sociology, then we treat it as merely psychological, forgetting that every individual is mediated by the society, as the society is mediated by these individuals. You know, we can, in the university, we can separate psychology and sociology, but not in reality, because the society goes deep into our guts. And of course, we are, as individuals, reproduce the society all the time. So it is this double mediation. So even if we would heal somebody who has these neuroses or whatever, if we send him back again, you know, into the society, he will be back 4 weeks later. So, so it would have, the solution would be to come to it from both sides. We have to deal with all these people who suffer from these neuroses, but we also have to deal with this reality principle, which is so antagonistic in itself, right, on both sides. The Christians also would say, you know, well, if we are pure in our heart and good and so on, if everybody would only be good, then the society would be good. It's not that simple, you know. Sometimes people are bad because society is as it is. And so both sides are, you know, are mediated with each other, and we must always, you know, attack it from both sides. We must think of social changes, and we must think then of these people who suffer this.
Yeah, we want to create a context which is a healthy context, in which people have every chance to advance and become fully human, and that's
unfold themselves, you know, their eyes, their ears, and so on.
And it's clear that the kind of a context we set up deeply influences what happens with people. There's no question about that. I think a really good example for me is, before I came out here, I ran a group home for teenagers. I had 11 teenagers living with me. They were all poor, 9 teenagers living with me. They were all poor, and they were, 9 of them were African American and 2 were Puerto Rican. These were kids who were going to school in high schools where they had very little chance of getting in college. One kid from Georgia that was with us, the percentage of kids from his high school that went to college the year before was 0, not one kid. We changed their context. We brought them up, brought them into a small school, had tutoring for them every night, and those kids ended up going to Ivy League schools and really good schools. So if we create the context for people, they have the opportunity to succeed, and I think we ought to do that.
And some cannot succeed at all in a competitive type of environment, but very well in a cooperative one, you see.
Exactly.
And so the question is, if we, you know, maybe we maybe we could, you know, balance it a little bit.
Right.
I mean, maybe there could be some competitiveness, but that the cooperative, solidary thing has to be lifted up somehow, you know. Or in other words, we say we spend too much energy in instrumental rationality, technology, and all this stuff, you know. And communicative rationality does not, it has been suffocated. So we fly in beautiful airplanes, at the same time our families disintegrate, our neighborhood disintegrate, and so on. And I think it endangers our civilization. So I don't say less technological and less powerful technology or whatever. I mean, we cannot turn that back. But I think we could lift up communicative rationality and communicative action and make people more competent, or as competent in that as they are now in flying airplanes or driving cars or whatever, you know.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think that those issues play themselves out on the local level.
Yeah.
And the
Definitely.
way we try to structure our society on this level is going to deeply influence how that influences our people.
Yeah.
I wanted to move to another area. I know that you have gone to Yugoslavia for, what, 20 years now, every year? At least once
25.
a year. 25
We had our
years.
anniversary, and we never missed a meeting there.
No matter what was going on in that
That's
country,
right,
and it
yeah.
was pretty active. I mean, I think that Yugoslavia is writ large ethnic conflict. And we don't have that level of ethnic conflict in our society, but racism is a reality in our society. And we have an enormous challenge in our society about how to live together as a community in a diverse society. So I'm wondering if your experience in Yugoslavia could throw any light, and your experience other places, throw any light about how, for our community.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I have had a course already under communism. I had a course about the future of religion and the whole tension between the secular and the religious and enlightenment and faith communities and so on. And so then the war came, this horrible ethnic catastrophe came, and we thought we had to stay with them. And so I went through the whole war, and by the way, here on the local level, I collected money and also medicine from the medical doctors and for the wounded, and I brought it at least twice a year then during the Civil War. So I was shot at there. I had to, all my skills from the Second World War, which the Prussians had taught me, I could use there again. So of throwing myself on the ground and all this was very thing. So the first time that I heard these things there, these bullets again flying through the air. So nevertheless, I saw how neighbor, you know, kills neighbor because one is a Serb and the one is a Bosnian, or another one is a Croat, and so on, and how the whole personality of the people changed. I didn't know them anymore suddenly, you know, and they seemed all to be sick. And now, in the meantime, it has, you know, it has been mellowed a little bit. But I was there last April, you know, and we had to fly very low because the NATO bombers were flying above us all the time. And then the MX underneath, which flies very low, and we saw the impact on the villages and you know, all over the place. So, what is most, for me, most irritating is the wrong picture which we have of this whole thing. You know, I mean, it was it was too far away. On the day when the bombing started, 50% of Americans did not even know where Kosovo was. So, I mean, who governs now, you know? I mean, if we are a democratic society, we should at least know where we are bombing, you know, or who is doing the bombing, or whatever. So, it is very hard then to understand all this, you know, what is going on. So these ethnic groups and why they hate each other so much. But there is a history and there is a logic in all of that, and one can understand it, you know, if one goes into it. And of course, we do, you were right, but if you look, you know, at the news there, for instance, on June 18 of this year, we had 3 synagogues were torched in Sacramento. On July 4th, the weekend, white supremacist Benjamin Smith shot at 6 Orthodox Jews, gunned down an African American in front of his kids, fired at an Asian American couple, then murdered a Korean student, and so on. You see, there is this issue, you know, with the anti-Semitism, which then spreads into other forms of racism. Yeah. On August 10, a reported neo-Nazi and Aryan Nations member, Bufford Furrow, stormed into a Jewish community center in Los Angeles, then shot and wounded 3 boys, 5, 6, and 8 years old, a teenage girl and an older woman, and so on and so on. And so that went through the whole year. So again, you know, I mean, I'm an educator, therefore I'm rather one-sided. I I believe, that enlightenment, does something. I mean, that one could slowly, analyze this stuff and know where anti-Semitism comes from and why that is always there and why one cannot get rid of it and so on, Or then also what one would have to do in order to get rid of it, right? So, and I think one can do, as a local politician, one can, of course, have ordinances or whatever against these things, and we do have all this, We have in Germany now a philosopher struggle. First we had a historian struggle, and these are revisionists, fascist revisionists, who want to revise, the past in order to find their identity again, and suddenly say, well, Hitler's Asian cruelty was the answer to Stalin's Asian cruelty, and thereby, relativizing Auschwitz and all these things. So these are very dangerous tendencies, and very vicious and so on, and deep-rooted. So if you don't get into the psychological, social, cultural roots of these things, there's no way to get at them,
Yeah, I think that on the city level now, we've tried to do a couple things over the years. We hired an organization in the Caris group to come in and look at the whole culture of all our workers. We have 950 workers in the city.
Yeah.
Look at the culture there and make strong recommendations. And they found some very, very dangerous things in our city. And what we're doing right now is that we have 4 to 5 hour workshops which are compulsory for every worker in the city about diversity and how to get along with other people.
Yeah.
I think that's a step in the right direction. It's not the total end of it. But it seems to me another end of it is to empower people. I remember Dr. King saying that if a group of people feels that they are not a part of a society, that group will try to destroy that society. So I think we have to keep that dialogue going and keep people in the dialogue about the direction. That we have to empower people to decide how the city goes.
Right.
And it can't just be one group of people. It has to be widespread, I think,
I mean, we have more of these right-wing extremist groups in Michigan than in any other state of the Union.
Amazing.
But you see, the reason is I think these people are very often rooted in the low middle classes, let's put it that way, so farmers and shopkeepers and so on. And this is a group of people who are very threatened.
Right.
They are threatened from below by the labor unions by pushing up the prices of labor. Their primitive capital accumulation is only so relatively low, so it really hurts them. It may have something to do with the resistance to the living wage, too. And then the big corporations, Target moves in, and the guys lose their stores and so on. So, and I think that this right-wing attitude or this supremacy thing and so on is somewhat an expression of this endangered species status.
Right.
To some extent, there, of course, it's a medieval class of people still, so it was there before modernity already. But somehow capitalism itself rationalizes tremendously and produces irrationalities on the other side. I thought that when I went to Detroit in the airport there, on one side, this high level of rationalization. On the other side, you have these masses with their bags there running against each other, shouting, screaming, and so on. They sent me to the wrong end to the airport, put me into a little car, then with this little car, toot, lights all over the place. I went through all these masses, and I had to divide the stream of these people and push them on the side, on both sides. So there is this strange contradiction of a highly rationalized type of system, how these airplanes fly and all this.
Yeah.
And on the other side, these irrational, chaotic type of things. Yeah. And I think that is an image for the society as a whole. While we get more and more rationalized, technically and so on, we produce those irrationalities on the other side. And people, when they feel threatened, if a whole class of people feel threatened, they strike out. See? And fascism becomes, or neo-Nazism, or whatever you want to call it, becomes the form in which they express themselves. I mean, this Hitler Renaissance, in Europe, and it's unbelievable, how many movies about him. And so on.
Right. And I think a lot of it plays out not just on the individual level, but in structural racism, which institutional racism, which I think we have to constantly look at.
Yeah, and the deeper study of anti-Semitism, too. B'nai B'rith and all these and other people could maybe do more to study this, because we think sometimes it has something to do with liberalism and capitalism and. Jews are always in circulation and in Wall Street and whatever, that's one level, but that's not where it comes from. It's much older. Then we think of Christianity and the anti-Semitism in Christianity, but it's much older, this anti-Semitism, even than Christianity, you know. So to get to the roots of these phenomena, you know.
Yeah,
it's important.
yeah. Well, geez, Rudy, this has been wonderful. We're running out of time here. And I just want to thank you so much for being with us today.
I want to thank you for all your beautiful work you do for our community. I have seen you for decades doing your work without getting tired even.
It's hard to get tired when I got so many great people that I work with. So thanks a lot.
Okay.
And we want to make sure that you take seriously Tuesday, the day that you can vote and make a difference in this city. Because the issues that we've been talking about deeply impact our lives, deeply impact our community, will make a real difference in the way we live and the way our children live. So it is important that you take the time on Tuesday to go to the polls, to let your voice be heard. Because it is only all of us together that can make this the community, the beautiful, the strong, the wonderful community that we want it to be, the just community that we want it to be. And it's only by, this is the whole purpose of democracy, the whole idea behind democracy, that we have the power and the right and the responsibility to govern ourselves. That plays itself out by your participation in the political process. So I hope you'll go to the polls on Tuesday, and I hope you'll vote. I hope you'll vote for me, because I want to work with you to try to make this the city that is the city of our dreams, the just city that we hope for, the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. Thank you.